Hi, this is Jim Charles with EHS Management Strategies, and welcome to our overview of the DOT Hazardous Materials Training Requirements. We still get out to a lot of organizations and do compliance audits, and this particular regulation tends to be one of the most misinterpreted rules out there. So I thought we'd put together a brief overview of the requirements, and hopefully this will help you review your operations and determine what training is appropriate for you and your staff. Quick disclaimer here, this is free information being provided for informational purposes only. How these regulations apply to your organization will be very site-specific and would require a site-specific review by a professional. So please consider that. EHS Management Strategies. We are a management systems consulting firm. We focus primarily on the auditing and implementation of management systems, either for your quality, environmental, or safety systems. We do some compliance evaluations to the environmental and safety regulations. We have a number of different internal auditor training packages. We do EPA, RCRA hazardous waste training, and DOT hazardous materials training. And we do have some of the best clients out there and really appreciate the work that they give us. The DOT hazardous materials training requirements are found in the DOT hazardous materials regulations found at 49 CFR 171 through 180. Most of the training requirements you'll find are in Part 172, and those are the requirements that we're going to talk about today. The hazardous materials rules cover everything related to the transportation of hazardous materials in the U.S. Very comprehensive set of regulations, covers the classification, packaging, hazard communication, transportation requirements and various modes of transportation, training requirements, incident reporting, emergency response information, and hazmat security. So the question is, who needs DOT hazardous materials training? And the type of training and level of training can be very specific to the responsibilities of the employee. First off, we have to be a hazmat employer. This is going to be any organization that transports hazardous materials in commerce. And if you work for a hazmat employer, you could be a hazmat employee. And a hazmat employee is a person who, in the course of their employment, directly affects the hazardous materials transportation safety. And this can include anybody who loads, unloads, or handles hazardous materials, prepares hazardous materials for transportation, is responsible for the safety of transporting hazardous materials, or operates a vehicle used to transport hazardous materials. So some of these activities can include pre-transportation activities. So if you're responsible for classifying hazardous materials, for packaging the materials or selecting the packaging, for marking, labeling, placarding vehicles or containers, providing emergency response information, or completing and or signing shipping papers, you too could be a hazardous waste employee. Persons responsible for loading or unloading hazardous materials, and this could include filling bulk packages with hazardous materials, transferring hazardous materials from one package to another during the transportation process. That's the caveat there. Loading or unloading trucks, rail cars, ships, airplanes, or other vehicles for the transportation of hazardous materials. So as an example, somebody who loads your packages into an airplane that includes a hazmat would require training. Other regulated activities could include storing shipments after a shipment has left the originating facility, but before it reaches its destination. So any storage in the transportation process. persons involved with the manufacturing, design, or testing of packaging intended to contain hazardous materials, or anybody who's involved in the actual transportation of hazardous materials. So example would be a truck driver, rail car engineer, airplane pilot would require hazmat training. As with all good regulations, there are some exemptions. The first one deals with anybody who's just basically unloading a package that contains hazardous materials after it's reached its final destination, and the hazmat is under the responsibility of the consignee, they call that, would be exempt from needing training. Anybody involved with the storage of hazardous materials at the originating facility. So if you work with hazardous materials inside your company walls, and it's stored and it's moved out to the shipping department, but your only responsibility is inside the company, you don't require training. Hazmat training becomes required the instant we start to load a vehicle, and that would be somebody who would again have to be able to load the vehicle properly. Any rail or motor vehicle movements of hazardous materials solely within the property boundaries. So if you are in a large facility, you had rail car delivery between two buildings, you're transporting via hazmat via truck between some buildings on the same property, that's not subject to DOT training. Surprise, surprise, any federal, state, or local government vehicles are exempt. And transportation for non-commercial purposes in private vehicles. So when we get home and we ship things between Lowe's and our house, that's not regulated. Or any other matter covered by the U.S. Postal Service regulations would be exempt. So the question becomes, who should get DOT training? DOT training could apply to people within your organization, logistics and shipping managers and supervisors, environmental managers or supervisors, shipping personnel loading hazardous materials into trucks, drivers who may be transporting hazardous materials, or anyone who may be packaging, marking, labeling, or filling out shipping papers should have some level of DOT training. So what type of training is required under the DOT rules? Well, the regulations are fairly generic and don't provide a lot of very specific training requirements. But here's what they require. First, there is a level of general awareness and familiarization. So anybody who is involved with hazardous materials at any level needs to understand that the hazards associated with and requirements for their position. Function-specific training, this is going to be specialized training for different functions related to hazmat shipments. Safety training, again, most of this is dealing with emergency response and employee safety. And some of these requirements may be met through other programs that you're already doing. And then security awareness training, everybody has to be aware of the potential hazards associated with the transportation of hazardous materials and potential security issues that could come up. And when must training be completed? Initial hazmat training is required within 90 days of employment. And prior to that 90 days, the employees must work under supervision. Training is required every 3 years to be in compliance. And this is a little bit different than the requirements for air shipping, which those folks need to be trained every 2 years. There needs to be some type of employee testing as part of this certification process. So there must be a quiz, an exam, or some other testing to validate that the employee is knowledgeable on the information that he's been trained to. And then the hazmat employer needs to keep and maintain training records. General awareness and familiarization training. Again, the rules don't really give us a lot of detail to go on. It says general awareness training should be designed to enable an employee to recognize and identify hazardous materials consistent with hazard communications and the standard of the DOT regulations. So basic awareness training should and could include a general overview of the DOT regulations, a explanation of the DOT hazard classifications and labeling requirements, and then basic requirements for handling and shipping, receiving hazardous materials. As you can see here, to give somebody a general awareness level of training is not a real high level of training. So anybody who touches a DOT hazardous material would require this first level of training. Function-specific training is just like the title sounds. Employees must be trained in the various functions of their responsibilities. So this could include if you're responsible for material classification and the use of the hazmat table, selecting packaging, container labeling and marking, if you're responsible to either fill out or sign shipping papers, vehicle placarding, or emergency response procedures. If any of those are under your responsibility, that's the type of training you should receive. So as you can see, different employees at different levels could, in theory, get different types of training. Maybe somebody gets an initial awareness training, 15, 30 minutes of training. They get their forklift training as part of their OSHA program. And then they get some basic training on how to properly load a vehicle. Versus a shipping manager, they might need a lot more understanding of the hazmat table and classification, shipping requirements, shipping papers, those types of things. Safety training, again, this type of training, it can be specific to DOT or it can be provided as part of your other OSHA and EPA-based training programs. So basic emergency response information, how an employee should respond to an emergency spill or other type of an emergency dealing with a hazmat, safe handling and the hazards associated with these materials. So basic hazard identification and PPE requirements, methods and procedures to avoid accidents. Again, proper procedures for handling packages containing hazardous materials, forklift safety training if it's required and they drive a forklift, or basic driving safety if they're going to drive a vehicle that contains hazmat materials. And now everybody needs to receive a basic level of DOT security awareness training. The training needs to include a basic overview of the security risk associated with the transportation of hazardous materials, methods designed to enhance transportation security, and how to recognize and respond to possible security threats. So this is a basic type of training that talks about making sure that the proper shipping company shows up, if somebody's acting suspicious, how you should respond, and those types of things related to the transportation of your hazardous materials. Organizations who are required to have a site-specific DOT security plan need to do enhanced security training. The requirements for the security plans you can find at 49 CFR 172.800. That'll tell you if your facility requires a specific plan. If you do have an on-site or site-specific security plan, the training needs to include an overview of the security plan and the employee's responsibility, the company's basic security objectives, an organizational structure for security issues, specific security procedures that are in place, specific security duties and responsibilities for each employee, and specific actions to be taken in the event that there's a breach of security. If you're involved with the actual transportation of hazardous materials in either air, vessel, or highway, there are additional training requirements that we're not really covering here. But again, if you work for an airline, if you work for a shipping company, or you're part of the ground transportation process, there are additional requirements that need to be met. Training documentation, again, is important as anything else. It should be noted that the hazardous material employer needs to create and retain a record of the current training for each hazmat employee. The training records need to include the hazmat employee's name, the most recent training completed and the date of completion, a description, copy, or the location of the materials used to do the training, the name and the address of the person providing the training, and their certification that the hazmat employee has been trained and tested as required by this rule. And again, it's the employer that is providing that certification. So if you go off-site to a DOT training class, that instructor, again, can provide most of this information, but really you need to verify that their documentation does include this information. And the records need to be stored for a minimum of 3 years. So I hope this brief overview of the DOT training requirements has been helpful. It should help you identify who in your organization needs training, the type of training that they need, and the best way to document that training. Again, please subscribe to our YouTube page. We would appreciate that. And look for additional overviews of different regulations that could apply to your organization. We're trying to get in the swing of things here and publish about one of these a month, and we'll see how that goes. So please do hit the subscribe button. And feel free to contact us at any time with any questions you might have relative to this regulation or anything else. The best way to get a hold of us is probably email. But again, we love to take your questions and answer them and help get you into compliance. And definitely appreciate your time and look forward to the chance to work with you guys. Thanks a lot. Goodbye.